Doing a little test.
Yeah.
It's working great.
Yeah, that's good. Go back.
Coming out there though.
Huh?
Coming out. Ready? These ones.
I don't know if I'm here. You mean turn this off? All right, so we're gonna start, y'all. Can everybody hear me? Come closer. A little closer. How about now? Better? Okay. All right, folks. Well, hello, hello, hello. Hi, everybody. My name is Latoya Johnson, and I'm sorry, I'll be looking in between in person and on Zoom here, just so y'all know what I'm looking at. But my name is Latoya Johnson, and I am the co-executive director of the New Orleans Worker Center for Racial Justice. Thank you all for coming out tonight, especially right before this holiday weekend. But before we start, let's go over a few housekeeping items. We all have our food here in-house. We have wonderful ushers tonight. There was Lisa and Rocio, Raul somewhere. They can escort you to the community room where childcare is, and they can point you in the direction of the restrooms or anything else that you may need. We are streaming live on Facebook, and there should be Spanish interpretation available. Our Facebook handle is at NOWCRJ in case you want to follow along or share with your friends and fellow coworkers. And last but not least, there is also interpretation happening as we speak, right? So everyone should have a headset. Does everyone have a headset that needs one? Okay. And so for folks in the room and folks online, a few hand signals to remember. So if you are speaking too fast, like I tend to do, right, you'll see this, right? So that means to slow down, right? If you are speaking too low, you may see not raise the roof, but this, right? That means to speak louder, right? And if the interpreter needs you to pause a second so they can catch up, you may just see this, which just means stop. Okay, everyone got that? For folks on Zoom. For folks on Zoom. Okay, so again, there is interpretation available on Zoom. In the lower panel, you may see the little globe that says interpretation. You want to click on that globe and pick the room language of your choice. So if you're an English speaker, you would click on the English room. If you're a Spanish speaker, click on the Spanish. Okay, everybody good? All right. Everybody good? All right. So now that we got that out the way, hey y'all, again. Again, my name is Latoya Johnson, and I am the co-executive director of the New Orleans Worker Center for Racial Justice, along with Lexi Peterson-Burge. Everybody give Lexi a wave. Hey, Lexi. Hey. Something just happened to my screen. There we go. So in lieu of our regular community meeting, we decided to have a discussion, a very specific discussion about ARPA funds and how we're fighting to get those funds redirected and allocated in specific ways to directly benefit workers and community members overall. So for those of you who may not know, in 2021, the federal government passed the American Rescue Plan Act, aka ARPA, to assist cities in recovering from the pandemic. New Orleans alone received $388 million meant to assist in the economic recovery of COVID-19 pandemic. Getting the raised roof signal, y'all. Okay, so New Orleans allocated the first $200 million almost entirely on anticipated tax revenue loss. In December 2022, City Council followed most of the mayor's recommendations and allocated about $120 million of the second half of ARPA funding, mostly to NOPD and some ineligible projects. So these funds, the ARPA funds, are supposed to be used in a few ways, right? So they could give premium pay to essential workers for the risk that they took throughout the pandemic, to support renters and impacted businesses to get back on their feet, to specific infrastructure needs like broadband internet, sewer, water projects, and also to overall to protect the health and safety of residents, all while addressing racial disparities, inequities, and disproportionate harm caused by the pandemic. So today we have two folks, amazing beings, here with us in the fight, in the allies with us to discuss what it all means and how is that relevant to us today as community members, right? So we have Maxwell Chardulo. Did I get that right? Chardulo. Director of Policy and Communications of LFHAC, Louisiana Fair Housing Accountability Center. Action Center. I like accountability too. I'm sorry. And we have Matthew Olson here, our senior researcher at New Orleans Worker Center for Racial Justice. Good evening.
Good evening.
Thank you too for being here again. So let's start by each of you telling us a bit about the organizations you represent, and also why they've engaged so heavily in this issue around ARPA funds. Who wants to start? Matt, you go first.
Me? Sure. Can everyone hear me okay? Okay, online, great. So Maxwell Chardulo, like you said, Director of Policy and Communications at the Louisiana Fair Housing Action Center. And the Louisiana Fair Housing Action Center is a 28-year-old now civil rights nonprofit that is based in New Orleans, but serves the entire state of Louisiana. And we were founded to fight housing discrimination and housing segregation. And so we do that in a couple of ways. We have attorneys on staff who help people who are facing eviction. We have attorneys on staff who help people who have faced housing discrimination. We also have a foreclosure prevention counselor on staff to help people who are at risk of foreclosure. And then we have outreach and education staff to make sure that people understand their housing rights under the Fair Housing Act. Thank you. I'll try and be louder. And then we have my team, which is the policy team. And the policy team's job is to work with elected officials, work with the public, and try and make sure that we are passing new and better laws to better protect people's housing rights. And so why do we care about American Rescue Plan money? I think our policy work actually started very much connected to disaster recovery and making sure that there were equitable outcomes for everyone in disaster recovery. And that started after Hurricane Katrina. And so after Hurricane Katrina, folks might have remembered the Road Home program, which was somewhat of a disaster in large part, or at least one of the main reasons why, is because it involved a discriminatory rebuilding formula. People who owned homes that were damaged during the storm were awarded funding to rebuild based on the value of their home before the storm, rather than the actual amount it cost to rebuild their home. And what that meant is that home values are largely determined by the race of the neighborhood you live in. So someone with the same storm damage to the same home in a black neighborhood versus a white neighborhood, that person in the white neighborhood was receiving much more in recovery money to rebuild. And we started getting these intakes from people who were telling us these stories. And we ended up suing the federal government and the state government and helping to bring a lot more recovery money to try and help out folks who had been shortchanged. So that is really the beginning of our policy work, and we see this to be very similar, right? The American Rescue Plan money is specifically supposed to be about recovering from the disaster that was and still is COVID and the economic impacts that have come since.
Allowed back in the city because they were closed and locked out of those properties with their belongings still inside. So from these oppressions that were happening between the communities, we were able to see common ground, right? And find that they actually had a lot more to gain by fighting together and recognizing how the state, how corporations were equally taking advantage of them in different ways, but ways that they could forge bonds of solidarity to organize together. So over many years, now it's 17 years later, we still support workers to address wage theft, to organize together, to build power, to change policies, mostly right now on city level and with this campaign. We got involved, of course, because one of those main ways that Arpa was supposed to make our communities whole was to support essential workers and give hazard pay to workers. So once we realized that the city had a lot of money still to spend, and this was last summer, and we kind of started to cohere around this idea of having a campaign, there was still $90 million the city still had left and just the city. And we thought other cities around the country, other states have already put money to support workers, and our city is not doing that, and that's not just.
There we go. All right, y'all. Uh-oh. Here we go. Sorry, y'all. Technical difficulties. All right. So the number one question that I get asked as an organizer in the field, right? What they got to do with me? Right? Everybody wants to know, why is this relevant to me as an individual, as a New Orleanian, how does this impact my day to day? Right? And so what would you like to relay to folks about why it is important that we not only know about these funds, but pay attention to how they're being allocated?
I mean, I can start. I think it's important because it's our money. I mean, that's really it. Like,
That's what I was gonna say.
yeah, I mean, this money was specifically designated to help the people who need it most after COVID and after the, unemployment that followed, and now the inflation that we're all dealing with. It was specifically designed to make sure that the people who were struggling the most would be able to recover and thrive. And so just to give you a sense, some of the things that we are proposing that the city do with that money is help repair housing that has health and safety violations and make sure it stays affordable. So if that's something that you've ever dealt with or people in your community are dealing with, that's one of the things we want to use this money for. One of the other things is just to build more affordable housing, because housing has become so tremendously expensive in New Orleans, especially when compared to the wages that people make. And we never spend a lot of money on affordable housing here, but we now have a huge pot of millions of dollars. And one of the best ways to use money, it's important to note, right? This is one-time money. So we got this big allocation of cash. It's not going to come every year after this. So we can spend it on things this year, but it won't be there next year. And one of the best ways to use money like that is to actually build brick and mortar housing. Because once you build it, it exists for decades into the future and can serve families for decades into the future. So from our perspective, these are just some of the things that we think the city should do with this money. And it's the kind of thing that we hope will have an impact on everyone, because we know that skyrocketing rents and home prices are having an impact on everything. So that's my short answer.
You want to ask?
Do you want to introduce
Yeah.
our joining panelists?
Okay, folks, we have one more panelist joining us. We have Cameron representing Vera. So would you like to introduce yourself? Tell us a bit about the organization and also why Vera is so heavily engaged in this issue around ARPA funds.
Yeah.
Okay. Can everyone hear me? Can I be heard? Okay. Can everyone hear me now? Better? Okay, excellent. Hi, everyone. My name is Cameron Opaque. I am a senior program associate at the Bureau Institute of Justice. We are a criminal justice reform non-for-profit. We have offices in New York, in Louisiana, in California, and we're really dedicated to investing more money into thriving communities as a way to make communities safer. I think one of the reasons why we're so involved in this effort, and it's important to us, is because we really want to get to the roots of what causes violence and crime in our neighborhoods, and we know that that's disinvestment. And so we are really pushing for the city to use this money to solve upstream problems. We know that structural violence, structural failures are what create lasting crime and violence and poverty in our neighborhoods, and it's the only way to fix that is to reinvest more deeply in our communities. And so as we try to end the criminalization of communities, we have to also reinvest in them with the same amount of investment.
Oh, thank you. Okay, so far, can you all tell me what concerns you about how the money has been allocated and spent so far, and what your respective organizations have done to either stop it or to get funds reallocated and redirected towards our efforts?
I can take that on.
Mhm.
Just briefly, I do want to address the previous question, which is like, what you tell a person on the street, why they should care. From our perspective as a workers organization, that was one of the main reasons they couldn't keep paying their rent or afford their mortgage, right? Is because they no longer had income coming in. So you had lost jobs, people being terminated illegally in some cases. People who had the right to remain on their jobs often were forced back to work in conditions that were unsafe, right? You had essential workers who might not have protective gear. You also had people that were ineligible for the payroll protection or even unemployment. The unemployment was that was a nice way to say it, overrun, and therefore a lot of people were not able to access that support. And so in that sense, the ways that we can address that are to, at this point, right, we're so far past that immediate moment of support, but we can still make some things right. So some of the proposals that we made to city council, that they could still give direct payments to families that were ineligible for these various programs, right? They could still give some support. It's still needed in our community, right? To make up. People might have taken on debts that they could pay back. And the next question.
Mhm. Repeat.
Yes.
So, what concerns you about how the money has been allocated so far?
Go for it.
That it hasn't been, but I'll like.
Yeah, I think, okay, so I'll talk a little bit about the budget. Bear with me, it's a lot of numbers and it's not super interesting, but the very short answer is it hasn't been allocated, and the way that it's been allocated has not been with community input. Essentially, the way in which the American Rescue Plan dollars were allocated at first. Sorry. The way in which the American Rescue Plan dollars were allocated at first were basically a pass-through. So the city took the money and gave a large portion of the money to the fire department. And then they defunded the fire department to turn that money into general fund dollars that they could use for whatever they wanted. Which is legal, but I would argue not ethical. It doesn't follow the spirit of what the money is for. They didn't use the money to support communities that were impacted by COVID-19. They didn't use the money in a way that the community asked for. They didn't ask for any type of community participation in any deep way. And then they gave large portions of the money to the police department. And even their most recent attempt at doing the work to help out the community really was is very small parts of this overall money. And as the Bureau of Governmental Research pointed out, that money was really to plug holes, and it wasn't actually used to sustainably fix the problems that were caused by the COVID-19 pandemic. So I have major concerns with the ways in which the city council has used the money. It is not democratic. It is not anti-oppressive. It is not supportive of communities that are in most need. It's negligent, to be frank.
I don't have a lot to add to that. I think that hits the nail on the head. They, the money was basically laundered through the fire department. And my biggest concern about that is that now, rather than that money sitting in the American Rescue Plan account, which has lots of rules attached to it about how it can be used and what it should be used on, it now sits in a different account called fund balance, which is just extra money that the city can do whatever it wants with. It doesn't have the same rules attached to it. And so a lot of our job is to hold them accountable to the actual rules attached and the spirit of what that money was intended for, not just using it on whatever they want.
Yeah, I'll speak a little bit to the type of engagement that the city decided to follow in this process, right? This money is worked out in spring of 2021 after the passage of the act. In anticipation of that, the mayor decides to turn the COVID task force into the Arpa related task force that is supposed to give recommendations on how this money could be used. It meets for a few months. It's unclear whether any of these meetings were open to anyone but the self-selected people by the mayor. They come out with a report that has kind of vague ideas about where it might go, but without any community engagement, right? The mayor herself doesn't really follow up on these very much, except for in the case of police recruitment. So there's all these other policy ideas that are just kind of floating around, but the mayor has not actually worked to engage with the community until actually other organizations start putting pressure on. Vera starts putting pressure on in 2022 in April. We eventually see that over here and we say, oh, okay, yeah, OCBNO has also been a part of this, trying to hold them accountable. The city council passes an ordinance in May saying that the mayor needs to monthly update them on how the money is being spent. We start kind of cohering around this campaign in July and August. And then the mayor said, oh, well, I'm going to host a couple of town halls, but it's essentially her standing up on a stage and through a moderator, who gets to select questions from the audience to ask her, and she can answer them however she wants. She can make more promises that she's not going to keep. In fact, she said that certain projects were not eligible for the funds, certain economic development projects, and then later those things were approved in the December budget. So there's a lot of hypocrisy, a lot of promises unkept, and not authentic engagement with residents.
Just to put,
Just to put a really fine point on that, the way that other cities have used this money have been pretty transformational. People have made housing, they have created violence prevention groups, they fixed roads, they've built shelters, they fed families. They have used this money in the spirit to try to undo some of the truly undoable trauma that came in the 2 years following the COVID-19 outbreak. And the city hasn't done that, just straightforwardly. It's very much like if I were given an allowance or a gift card to a place, and I went there, I used my gift card to buy something and then sold that thing to launder the money back to myself. And so now I have $50 that I can just use for whatever I want to, as opposed to using it for the thing that it was designed to be for. And I want to be very clear about this. This is legal, but it does run the risk of causing the city to get audited, because this isn't what the money is for. Very straightforwardly, like it is not to just pay people back or fill in budget holes. It is for the people who are most impacted by this, which is Black and brown families that have been devastated. People lost people, and so it isn't simply a matter of, oh well, if they could do a little bit more. They haven't done anything. And that's concerning.
Got it. Okay, folks, wanted to do a time check. We're at 7:30. I have an interpreter in person and I have an interpreter online. Are we okay to continue, or do you all need a break? Eric? Okay, so we heard some solutions and we've heard how other cities have used some of the money. What are we proposing? Or what are your respective organizations proposing that the city actually do specifically with that money here in the city of New Orleans?
I'm happy to start. So we made 5 separate proposals. into housing, anyone who wants, who's able to do that or wants to do that. We also proposed $10 million to fix up rental units that have health and safety violations, to make sure that they are up to code and safe, and then to make sure that they stay affordable for a certain period of time after that. And then similarly, we proposed $10 million to help low-income homeowners, typically people who are on a fixed income, who also have serious health or safety issues that could, eventually make their home unlivable. And so to help them fix up their home so they can stay. And then lastly, the city actually has a fund already that's called the Anti-Displacement Fund. And it is specifically designed to be available for people who are being pushed out of their homes because their landlord refuses to fix a serious health or safety violation. So some of you may have seen in the news last year that there were some apartment complexes here in New Orleans, one in particular on the West Bank called Oakmont, that the city had to evacuate people from because it was in such terrible conditions. And so it's for instances like that. We want to make sure that there is funding in this anti-displacement fund to help provide people with a hotel room in the interim and security deposit to find a new place, help to store their things in the interim if we need it. So those were the 5 proposals that we put forward for housing.
So along with those proposals, which are excellent, thank you, Maxwell. We're also putting forth using $20 million to create for youth development. So 10 million of that dollars would go towards the Children, Youth and Planning Board. They do a lot of really wonderful work in the city for young people and to create a network, basically. So there are lots of small, really important community organizations that work with young people, that invest in young people, that don't have the money to really be connected with other organizations. And so the Children, Youth and Planning Board is basically creating a network so those folks can know who's doing what, who's working with what you, so that we can better serve young people in the cities. And the other $10 million will go to building the capacity of these community-based like youth supporting programs. Very simply put, when you invest in young people, it's always a good thing. So we're hoping that we can get that $20 million. The other thing that we're doing, so we're asking for $2 million to kind of build up our community violence intervention programs. The city doesn't really fund the Office of Gun Violence Prevention very well. And they are currently running we're running barbershop programs, hospital visitation programs. They're running youth mentoring programs, and we really want to expand the amount of services. We see that in other cities when they get even a couple $1 million that they've been able to pull off 25-30% reductions in shootings. And so we're looking to make this small investment. To put this in context, $2 million for a community violence intervention program is a drop in the bucket. The police department's budget last year was $176 million. I'll say that again, $176 million. To put that in further context, that's a little bit over 22% of the total budget. And this year, their budget's a little bit smaller, but they're also getting a bunch of money from the Arpa. So we're asking for $2 million for community violence. And to be fair, the council member said that that's a little bit too low. So I'll take them up on that offer to make it $20 million. Sounds great to me. But we're looking to get a pretty robust investment in how we do community violence prevention. Given that, people are always talking about how the violence problem, we figured it might make sense to spend money on the people who try to fix the violence problem. So those are the 2 really big proposals that we're asking for the money.
All right,
Yeah.
folks.
Oh,
I'm sorry.
Can I
Yes.
address?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, the proposals that the Worker Center helped develop and added to the platform were around community equity. And actually, some of them were developed in this very room. If some of you might have been here in August, September, was when we developed some of those proposals through hearing from residents and what was affecting them most throughout the pandemic and what would help them and support them and that could help their neighbors as well. So a lot of those came down to transportation, support with food, getting food on the table for their families. It came down to issues of wage theft, access to government services. That could also be through issues with translation of documents or knowing what the government is actually providing, what information they're sending out to the community and what is available. And also the fact that many people were not eligible for all the stimulus payments. That there were 3 different acts that were passed during the pandemic that gave people who had social security numbers or had filed taxes, they were able to, for the most part, receive those stimulus payments. But then we know that there's lots of residents who may not have a social security number or may not have filed for various reasons, or perhaps were arrested and not able to access the means to get those payments, to be in touch with Treasury or other bodies that could help them. So our policies addressing that we started to develop, start kind of from the last to the first, was a direct payment policy where the city, in line with the guidance that there should be support of essential workers for what they contributed to our economy, that we should have direct payments for those who are ineligible for stimulus payments. It was actually much more moderate than we had originally proposed. We had proposed about $40 million of support. And we, not knowing that there might be more funds available in the general fund, we lowered that all the way down. The next was language access. So there have been dozens and dozens of mid-sized cities, so even smaller cities than ours. Of course, most of the larger cities in the United States that have language access plans that are very thoroughly developed so that people with the most frequently spoken languages in their community can access government and access city departments. Can know what's being said in deliberations, in city council meetings, or in other official bodies. This is not true here. Through us going to city council regularly and having our own interpreters, they have occasionally responded by saying, oh, the worker center is going to be there. Maybe we should actually contract to have someone available. But it needs to be standard and it needs to be available for the most frequently spoken languages. So we included Vietnamese as well in our proposal, because there are estimated 4,000 Vietnamese speakers in New Orleans. Another of the proposals was for a labor audit. So while we don't have control over raising the minimum wage here locally, that's a state issue. The legislature would have to pass that. We can have an impact on workers under city contracts. And that includes workers who might be on a subcontract of a city contract. Think of all the capital projects, the construction projects that the city decides to and agrees to spend on, including if we do affordable housing construction. We'd also want to make sure that the workers on those projects as well were paid living wage.
Okay.
But the city has no information or does not make it publicly available about what the wages and the payroll is on any of their contractors. There's a place to submit complaints, but we don't know. So this policy would address that by making it publicly available and establishing an essential worker task force.
Okay.
I'll do the last 2 very quickly. Transportation, $5 million for 0 fares. And we've even spoken to the RTA and they're in favor of this because it would not reduce revenue for them. People would be able to ride for free. And this would give actually a lot of information to the transportation system to understand how they might invest better in the future, to know which routes they need to expand, which routes maybe they don't need to expand, which, you know, if paratransit could also be expanded, paratransit being like the smaller buses for people that have mobility issues. And lastly, food aid. So supporting people directly now that need that support.
You're welcome. Sorry. Okay, so we know what ARPA is, American Rescue Plan Act, right? We know how much money was allocated to the city. We know what we're proposing to do. So as individuals, as community members, what are our action steps? What are we asking folks to do? What can they do to support the initiative? I have to turn it off.
Okay.
You can still hear me? Okay, sorry. What are we asking people to do? I think what we're doing is putting pressure on the chief administrative officer, and the chief administrative officer is the guy who's generally in charge of the budget. So that's what we're doing, right? We all showed up at a city council hearing that they didn't expect us at, and said, we've been asking you for months about this. It's time for you to put us on the agenda, and they finally did. And so we were there earlier this week, and we got to speak directly to council members. And we're going to follow up with them, and we're going to ask for meetings directly with the chief administrative officer. So we're going to continue to put that pressure on. We're going to continue to keep this issue in the press, in the newspapers. I think what everyone can do, because not everyone can make it to a city council meeting, right? They happen in the middle of the day, in the middle of the week. Most people are at work. But we're going to make sure that there are opportunities for everyone to get engaged. And that can mean something as simple as making a quick phone call, writing an email to someone, showing up at events like this. But, you know, the idea is that that's on us to make sure that there are opportunities for everyone to get involved. So that, you know, regardless of when you're at work or when you have free time, there's an opportunity for you to help put some pressure on those elected officials as well.
I don't have a ton to add on top of that. One thing I will say is, you can tell people about this. The number of times I've talked to people and I'm like, how much money do you think that the city is currently sitting on right now? They don't know. The American Rescue Plan Act, the city hasn't been transparent. They haven't been really forthcoming. So a lot of people don't know that $388 million came to the city. And we're not using any of it for the things that they would like to use it for. And so I always think it's valuable to share information with folks. I also think it's valuable to organize. We are gonna go back if they don't make these things happen. And so I think it's incumbent on us to communicate when that is. And even if you can't physically show up to the hearing, like I was saying, you can submit public comments. You can, we can flyer, we can pay for the thought process here is we will continue to escalate the degree to which we are in our elected official spaces until they do what is right. And so I think being here is an excellent, important step. I think staying connected and keeping a list or some documentation of the things you need. So that when folks are looking to say, what do we spend money on? What's the most important thing? You have an easy answer to be like, I want these three things, period. Those are really, I think those are really important things. But also organizing is great. Join an organizing group. Be here.
All right, thank you. So I think in a few minutes, we're going to take questions from the audience virtually and in the room. But first, we're going to take a little break. So it is now 7:50. We'll be back at around 8 o'clock. Okay. All right. Thank you.
right, folks, we are back. Thank you for allowing us to take that short break. Hope y'all go ahead and turn on your cameras. I'm ready. All right, how's that?
Mine's still disabled. Mine's disabled. Oh, okay, well.
And so we learned a lot today. We also appreciate you all coming out. And before we wrap up, you all have any additional comments, any requests from the audience?
Oh, there we go.
I got it. So do y'all have any additional comments that y'all wanted to add before we wrap up and take questions from the audience? Or any action steps that you want the world to take? Or the world, the city of New Orleans and the world.
The Louisiana Fair Housing Action Center has a easy like email action that anyone can take if you have an email. So the easiest way to find that is if you follow us on social media or find us on social media, either Facebook, Instagram, or Twitter, Louisiana Fair Housing. And one of the top 2 or 3 posts should be an opportunity to take action. You can click through and it takes just a couple seconds. And it'll let you send an email to your council members and the mayor and the chief administrative officer specifically about this. So that's one quick thing everyone can do.
So the Vera Institute of Justice, we are not a base building organization, so there are not a lot of ways in which folks can like directly get involved in our work because we're a nonprofit and do that stuff. However, we do work with a local organizing group called Fund the People, and Fund the People is currently looking for new members to join to do their more explicitly like moving money from the criminal justice system back into communities organization. So you can find them on Instagram at Fund the People New Orleans. And so if you they're a good group. We work with them, even though I'm a member of both technically. But as a Vera person, there isn't a lot that I can point you to. But for Fund the People, there's a lot you can do with that group.
Okay. Thank you again. I think we can move to audience questions. I actually think that Marvin, I'm gonna let you ask your question. That was you, right? I gave it. Okay. So I'm gonna cut this off.
The CAO's office like kind of pushed for the money to be allocated to the fire department. I found out this was happening much later after the fact. I was looking at the city's budget documents, and there's a really fun chart where you see the fire department's usual funding, and its usual makeup is largely city funding because it's the fire department. And then that's in 2021. And then in 2022, you see that it's mostly federal dollars and a little bit of like general fund, like city money. And that is the rinsing of the money. That's the allocation there. I know that there were several people, I know Nelly is one of them, who really pushed the city to do something with this money, to push them to be more engaged. But there wasn't a lot of media pushback about it. The kind of people were kind of a little busy. So importantly to point out, people were busy doing a lot of things. It was not a quiet time in the city. But there was also it's extremely boring. If I'm gonna be frank, as a person who works on the budget, I read the budget document. It's 400 plus pages long. Lots of charts. The language is very unclear. No matter what your first language is, it's extremely difficult to read. And so you don't really notice this allocation really happening of this money. And the city it said, if you ask, I wish I did, Gilbert, the CAO, what the money was used for, he's not going to say, oh, well, we rinsed it with the fire department. He's going to say, well, we use it for back pay for lost revenue, which is technically true, I guess, but is not clear, and it's not it's not well documented on the website. So if you go onto the city's website right now and you go and look at the American Rescue Plan dollars, how they've been allocated in the first tranche, it will say that roughly 162 million of the total 198 million went to the fire department, which is preposterous, right? But that is what that's what it says on there, and that's them complying with the city ordinance. So to answer your question, the mechanics were that they basically, the CEO office was like, this is what needs to happen. The council also, no offense to them, and don't, I guess, quote me on this, they don't know a lot about how the budget works either. And so they kind of rely on the a good faith effort from the CAO's office about where the money goes. And so, they kind of showed them, they're like, this is where you should allocate the money. Just say, give it to the fire department, and we'll move it around. Because the CAO's office has the authority to move and appropriate money that's been appropriated already based on some strange powers that I don't even understand. And I've been looking at the budget for months, but he can do that. So in short, the mechanism behind it was that people weren't really paying attention. People were busy, and the council doesn't really understand how the budget works. And there was no downside to it. It's technically legal to use the money for a department. It's just that the fire department never really in any real way received that funding. They got the funding and they lost their local funding, and that local funding created a surplus that the city council could then, or the city council or the mayor could use as they see fit.
Yeah.
Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, I would say that the media has also gotten a pass on this. I've traced all of the mentions of ARPA money since it was passed in the city. And it's always, none of it's investigative, none of it's really pushing to get information about why is this normal? Other cities across the country are doing projects, programs, little by little, like the policies that were suggested. Almost no other cities are doing this, like enormous $200 million is going into this one department and without any descriptive language about what it's going to do. And I think that approach this should all go to tax loss when it's not even known that there is a loss is just extremely conservative in an economic sense. So economists would view this as like the very safe approach. Whereas if you look at the reason for the stimulus payments from the federal government in the first place, is that if you invest in people, they're going to spend it. They're going to spend it on what they need. That those tax revenues are going to come back to the city. If you were proactive, you would actually see a positive outcome from that money, but it's just been sitting there and people are still dying. And it's happening again right now because they're still sitting on hundreds of millions of dollars.
Next.
Well, the only context I'm going to add is that when they first did this in 2021, like our tourism industry was still kind of in the toilet, right? Like we had not recovered. And so there is at least, like, I have some understanding of why they were like, the city is not going to bring in the same amount of revenue we would in a regular year. So we're going to just fill in where that revenue is missing. Because we don't have the same tourist dollars, we don't have the same tax revenue, sales tax revenue, et cetera, et cetera. The problem comes when at the end of the year, we did way better than expected. There was a lot more revenue. And so we had filled in revenue that we didn't need to fill in, and nobody corrected for that. Nobody said anything, admitted it, and said, turns out
we have a lot more money now and we can spend it on all these other things. They just let it be quiet. And again, there wasn't good investigative journalism about it. Nobody talked about it. And it all ended up in this other fund, which doesn't have any of the, restrictions or rules attached to it that we've been talking about.
And is that why during the council meeting, it sounded like there was even a further surplus or something, expecting?
Yeah, I mean, because some of this money has been allocated for to fill in salaries, right? But then, and some of them are to fill in salaries for positions for staff people they still have to hire. And they don't ever end up filling those positions. And so at the end of the year, that money just rolls over into this surplus fund. And it's more and more money. So we're gonna have more at the end of this year. I think someone told me today that this police department alone is expected to have $70 million that they didn't spend.
Yep.
So there's more coming.
And it continues, the police department had $70 million surplus last year. Yeah, and even more, well, probably even more this year. There's a lot of wishful thinking that we're gonna magically, people are gonna come and take those jobs. And so they're they're hesitant to spend that money, but obviously there are other things that are needed at that moment. So yeah.
Now, there's one question that you wrote on here that you didn't ask, that I thought was pretty important. Oh. And so, regarding how the money got, what was a nice way that you put it, rinsed. Money got rinsed, how do we prevent that from happening next time? Hopefully that won't be a next time we're in that situation, but in case there is, how do we prevent that?
Yeah. I mean, I think this is a really, this process has been helpful for all of us to bring a little bit more light on the fact that our city budget process is kind of a joke. And almost no one knows where that money goes, and the decisions all get made behind closed doors. And there are very few opportunities for people to comment on it or even understand how it's happening. And so, I mean, this is a question specifically designed for Nellie Katzen and Committee for a Better New Orleans, because this is her passion, is trying to make this process more transparent and trying to make sure that more people are involved in it. And so it's my hope that this debacle means that in the future, there will be more of us raising our voices and saying at every budget process, every year, even when there's not millions of federal dollars, in play, that we're all there at the table and talking about where that money needs to go.
And this happens also not just during budget season, but there's money that's shifted around at almost every budget meeting, almost every city council meeting. They're taking some money from here, putting it over here. Today, there was another $3 million that may or may not have been allocated.
Yeah.
So this is happening all the time too. We don't have to wait until, October, September, October to ask for transparency. One of the things that I didn't even realize when I started getting deeper into this was how little information they share with the public about the ordinance each piece. I tried to trace back because in December 1st, when the budget was passed, there was this last minute amendment. And a lot of this ARPA money went through without any communication to us. We're like, well, how did this get through? And I actually traced back to October, a special session where the mayor presented her budget. And there was a first reading of the amendment that eventually passed on December 1st. But it has no information. There's nothing, it's just a line that says this much may be appropriated from this particular fund within the city government and go to this. And they can amend it to change it wherever they want. They use that, oh, we already had a first reading. So now we can actually pass it. Usually you have to wait for one council meeting for public comment. So some of these ways that if we don't actually see the language of what is contained in that ordinance, how is the public supposed to be involved? How are we supposed to even know what they're doing? So that's a process issue, which.
So the short answer is transparent.
Well, so
Anyways.
I want to, let me be very clear. I am pro transparency. I'm not about to rain on transparency, but transparency is actually one component
of accountability. It is not in itself accountability. So there was a key moment in which we were presenting to the city council and they were like, okay, fine, we'll be transparent about, we'll release a white paper, which never happened, but we'll release a white paper that explains where all the ARPA money has gone. Well, that doesn't do you any good because it's already gone, right? And so like, they're like, well, you can be transparent all you want after the fact or like mildly during the fact, but being accountable and has to do with being held to account to what's happening and being participatory and inclusive are the key components, right? Like there has to be, there was an ordinance passed where they had to update with how the ARPA dollars were spent. They did not do that. They broke that law boldface, right? But even if they did, it doesn't mean that means that we have levers of engagement. It doesn't mean they're required to have a hearing before the money is spent, right? It doesn't mean they're required to sit down like we're sitting down and explain themselves, right? It's very different to hold them account to actually doing an action and ceding power as opposed to being able to just be transparent. I want to be very clear. I love transparency, and that is a very important first step. But they are made it very clear. Look, we can be transparent about it, like, but we're not actually giving you any power, or more importantly, we're not going to cede your demand for power. And I think it's really important that we push them to do that. Yeah, and one last point I will name is that a prime example of this happening. I used to watch the budget meetings all the time on Zoom because what else do I do with my time? And at one point, I'm not even joking, the CAO's office decided that they were going to spend the money that the city uses to pay its light bill to buy more vehicles for the police because they were on sale. And then they would later, during the mid-year adjustment, pay themselves back, like shift the money back with the city's money. I was like, I don't know. I didn't know you could even do that. I was like, and most people, when I tell them, like your faces right now, are like, what do you mean you spent our light bill money on new police vehicles? That seems like a thing you shouldn't be able to just do and then be like, don't worry, it's basically the same. And so when the mid-year adjustment came along, instead of asking the council for money for police cars, he's asking the council to pay the city's light bill, which is a very hard thing for the council to say no to, right? And so I also think there's some question about how much power that office holds and what that transparency looks like for non-elected folks who are in charge of large buckets of money as well. So just want to lay that out there.
Do we have any other questions?
I do. I'm wondering I know what has happened in the past, and I think I'm so confused with the numbers. I'm sure everyone is, but I'm thinking there was 388. They spent 168 to the fire department, and there's 190 something plus change sitting in an account. But what happens now? Like, how do we hold them? How do you hold them accountable going forward? Like, what does that look like specifically? When do they meet again? Do y'all go back to the council meeting again to ask them questions?
Yeah, the next meeting is Thursday, a week from today, in City Council at 10 a.m. It's a budget committee hearing. And the health department will definitely be on the budget and they are on the agenda, excuse me, making a request for 20 or $30 million worth of programming, most of which we all agree with and have been working with them. I would say the health director is maybe one of the more accountable department heads in the city. And but we've heard that the CAO, the Chief Administrative Officer, will be there as well to talk about other requests. So we're going to all be there to provide comment in public and ask him to uphold our requests. We're also making meetings with the council members who we presented to this week to follow up with them and keep the pressure on them. I mean, I think that's part of that's like the inside strategy in terms of like, right, we're going to keep meeting with them, putting pressure on them. But I think, you know, the other piece is what Cameron talked about before, which is like, tell your friends, tell your neighbors. You know, we have to make sure that everybody knows about this, and that even if we can't all show up for council meetings, everyone is putting that pressure on through phone calls, emails, et cetera. Is
Is there a specific deadline that they're held to? Like, obviously, they just can't keep kicking the can. Or maybe they can. I don't know how this works. At what point?
So last year, they're allowed to allocate is for 2024, so they could hold this until November, I suppose.
Well, that is one thing that I forgot to mention. I guess the most obvious question would be, oh, sorry. The one thing that I forgot to mention was that the most obvious reason why the city council would rinse this money was because the money is time limited. In the ARPA money is time limited. But when you send that money through the fire department and you have a better revenue than you expected, you end up with just general money. And I'm not going to talk about what the name of the fund is. It's just in the fund balance. And as a result, that doesn't have a deadline. So theoretically, they could continue to kick the can for the fund balance money. The actual American Rescue Plan dollars that were originally allocated, technically that money has been spent. I think there's only 70 or so million dollars of that left over. And the rest of the big pot that we're talking about is functionally the same money, but it does not have the same requirement, which is why you rinse the money. So instead of having a gift card that you can only spend at Target, you now have cash that you can just keep for as long as you want. But I do think there are ways that people can show up and be part of this work. I think what is incumbent on us is to make that as approachable as possible. I know that not everyone has the freedom or the luxury or the privilege to go to the council at 10 a.m. on a Thursday or on a Tuesday. And I think creating more on roads for folks is also part of the work as well. Would I love for everyone to show up and boo Gilbert? Yes, I would love that personally. You can tell him that. But I do think that what we're trying to do is to follow up, get an idea of where our last presentation landed, so we can build a strategy where we continue to escalate the amount of work in your face we are about this until we get that money, because there, as I said before, isn't an intrinsic deadline anymore for that part of the money.
As a base building organization, the Worker Center, of course, is a place. We have organizers that are here that you can get involved in. That they're, as part of a growing base or as an ally to our organization. So I would encourage you to speak with them. I believe the budget is also on the table for next Wednesday, different departments. Yeah. But also next Wednesday.
Okay. So I don't think we have any more time for any more questions, but if anyone does have any more questions, I don't know if they're still running. Feel free to ask one of the organizers, come up and ask one of us. But right now, we have one of our organizers, two of our organizers, I'm sorry, introduce yourselves and give us the next steps update from the work.
Can you turn your camera, Matt? Hi, everybody. Welcome. Thanks for coming. Thanks for listening. And thank you guys for all this information. Because as they said, this is the most important thing is for us to let people know, because nobody really knows about this money. They don't know about the potential to help us. So talking to your neighbors, coworkers, your family, friends. The other thing you can do.
Wait, who are you?
Oh, sorry. I'm Jeanette. I'm an organizer with the New Orleans Worker Center for Racial Justice. And this is my colleague.
Hola a todos, mi nombre es Rocío Aguilar, organizadora también con el Centro de Trabajadores por la Justicia Racial.
We are having a vigil next Wednesday before the final budget meeting on Thursday. We're doing it because we want to honor the people that we've lost, the family members, the friends. Losses people who've lost their homes, their jobs. All those losses that could have been prevented had some of this money in 2021 been given to people when they needed it the most. When we were still in the middle of a lockdown, and we as a community need to honor each other and honor those losses and put more pressure on city council to spend this money on the community. You know, you can volunteer. You can follow us on social media at nowcrj.org. On our website, follow us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. We'll give you updates. You can volunteer online. You can volunteer here in person. If you want to just give us your social media contacts, we can tag you on all the social media so you can share with your friends and share the information. You know, that's really the most important thing, especially for folks, you know, like we said, the showing up at 10 a.m. on a Thursday morning is awfully difficult. We're having the vigil on Wednesday from 1 p.m. to 7 p.m. in the hopes that people can come out, share their stories. If you're willing to do that, if you know other people who have, you know, felt an overwhelming sense of loss, no matter what that may be, we'd like to share it and honor it next Wednesday. Because in this case, loss of life, you know, loss of money did equate to a loss of life. You can also share this panel recording with your friends and family, neighbors. But showing up, even if it's just doing a comment online the night before, you can't go to a city council meeting, you know, supporting the fair housing, supporting now CRJ, supporting Vera, because all these are preventative offerings to the government.
Así que ya saben, está invitado este próximo miércoles 12 de abril de 1 a 7 p.m. Vamos a tener música, vamos a tener comida, vamos a estar conociendo a personas en la comunidad, ¿verdad? Vamos a tener espacios comunitarios para que usted también pueda conocer a muchas de las personas que han estado como defensores de lo que es el dinero de Arpa. Entonces, venga este miércoles, acompáñenos, ¿verdad? Si usted está disponible para hacer cualquier tipo de voluntariado o incluso contar cuál fue su experiencia. Es increíble que esté este dinero que ha sido, ¿verdad?, que es de nuestra comunidad, que es para la comunidad y que todavía, ¿verdad?, esté almacenado, si se puede decir de esta manera. Es importante que ese dinero llegue ahora a la comunidad. Es importante que llegue a los trabajadores, a sus familias, a esas personas que están a punto, no solo, o sea, que han perdido mucho durante todo este tiempo, pero que están a punto también de perder más, ¿verdad? De quedar sin hogares, ¿verdad? De no tener que comer en casa. Hemos visto de cerca cuán difícil fue para la comunidad todo este tiempo durante la pandemia y es tan molesto, doloroso e increíble que todavía sigamos con dinero guardado. Se debería estar apoyando a la comunidad en este momento. Así que los esperamos este miércoles de 1 a 7 p.m. Ahí vamos a estar todos. Y también agradecer a muchos, ¿verdad?, de los que están aquí porque han trabajado junto a nosotros, ¿verdad?, para poder también llegar cuáles son las mejores formas de usar este dinero, ¿verdad? Todos sabemos, todos porque lo hemos vivido, lo experimentamos, sabemos cuál es la mejor forma de usar este dinero y agradecer a todas esas personas que se han juntado para entregar una propuesta en conjunto a todas las organizaciones que han trabajado. Así que la esperamos este miércoles. Véngase, disfrute con nosotros y hagámosle saber a esta gente, a estos gobernadores, a nuestro gobierno local, que la comunidad se está dando cuenta de cómo ellos lo están haciendo y no está bien. Y tenemos que estar vigilando, estamos aquí presentes para hacerles saber a ellos de que tienen que ser responsables, transparentes con lo que es el dinero de la comunidad. Otra cosa, y para último, también recordarles, ¿verdad? Ya viene el 1 de mayo, Día Internacional del Trabajador. Vamos a estar teniendo una marcha. Si usted quiere conocer y aprender más de lo que es el 1 de mayo, ¿verdad? Podemos también hablar de eso. Si quiere voluntariar para ese evento también, ¿verdad? Pero lo importante, haga presencia, no tiene que, si siente que no puede hacer un esfuerzo más grande, el hacer presencia es lo mejor. Así que Con eso podemos cerrar. Muchas gracias. Thank you.
All right, wait, don't go anywhere, don't go anywhere. So y'all, we have come to the end of the town hall. However, Rocio, we put you on the spot. Let's bring this back. FYI, y'all been with the organization since 2011. I want to bring this back. Not the clap in the half, but what is the slow clap? But you're gonna have to explain the folks what it is.
El pequeño es el aplausimiento. Not the clap in the half. Quieres el aplauso de la victoria.
Yes.
Aquí hay muchos que se lo saben. Entonces, como toda lucha,
Everybody up, everybody up, everybody up.
como toda lucha, movimiento, muchas veces, ¿verdad? Empieza lento. Pero en algún momento todos toman fuerza. Así que vamos a aplaudir despacio, despacio, despacio. Vamos a ir dando más fuerte. Usted puede gritar, usted puede patalear lo que quiera. Y después, al final, gritamos. Porque como toda lucha profesional, empieza lento, pero hay que tomar intensidad. Y como decían los panelistas, si hay que escalar, hay que hacerlo. Porque es la única forma muchas veces que nuestro gobierno responde de la manera correcta. Vamos a empezar. A la cuenta de tres. 1, 2, 3.